Officer, that's my car. Why is it being towed?
Sir, it was parked in a no-loading zone.
I was only inside for 10 minutes.
I understand, but the law is clear. You can claim it at the impound lot.
Power can be a dangerous drug, especially when it comes with a badge and a gun. But arrogance is the quiet poison that destroys the hand that wields it. Officer Gideon Holt thought he was untouchable when he spotted a luxury sedan parked near the courthouse and decided to tow it out of pure racial spite. He wanted to teach the driver a lesson about who owned the streets, but Holt made one fatal mistake. The car belonged to the new district attorney, and the DA wasn't just going to get his car back. He was going to dismantle the officer's entire life. Oakage County was a place of two distinct realities, neatly divided by the murky waters of the Conover River. On the north side, manicured lawns and gated driveways hid old money and generational power. On the south side, cracking pavement and flickering streetlights watched over a community that had been over-policed and underprotected for decades. Marcus Langston grew up on the south side. Now, as a man in his prime, he sat in the corner office of the downtown courthouse as the newly elected district attorney. Langston was a force of nature, tall, impeccably tailored, and possessing a mind like a steel trap. He had campaigned on a single unwavering promise: accountability. He was the first black district attorney in Oakage history, and his election had sent a localized earthquake through the county's political establishment. But nowhere was the aftershock felt more violently than in the precinct houses of the Oakage Police Department. Officer Gideon Holt was a relic of the old Oakage, a veteran of the force with many years under his belt. Holt was a thick-necked, heavy-handed patrolman who viewed the streets as his personal domain. To Holt, the law was whatever he said it was at any given moment. He had amassed a staggering number of citizen complaints over his career, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling, but the police union and a sympathetic old guard police chief had buried every single one. Holt hated Marcus Langston with a visceral, consuming passion. He hated the DA's reform policies. He hated the mandatory body camera audits Langston had instituted. And if he were being brutally honest with himself in the dark of night, he hated the fact that a black man from the South Side now held the power to put cops in prison. It was a blistering afternoon, the heat radiating off the asphalt, thick enough to choke on. Langston had just wrapped up a grueling grand jury presentation regarding a corrupt city contractor. Exhausted but focused, he had parked his personal vehicle, a pristine midnight blue luxury sedan, in the overflow municipal lot just a block from the courthouse. It was a space explicitly reserved for county officials, and Langston's official laminated placard was displayed dead center on the dashboard. Holt was cruising his sector in his patrol car, the air conditioning blasting, a lip full of chewing tobacco turning his saliva brown. He was already in a foul mood. Earlier that week, Langston's office had refused to prosecute a drug possession case Holt had brought in, citing an illegal warrantless search. Holt felt humiliated. He felt emasculated. As he turned the corner onto Elm Street, the midnight blue sedan caught his eye. Holt slowed the cruiser to a crawl. He knew exactly whose car it was. The grapevine in the police department was faster than fiber optic cable, and every cop in the precinct knew the new DA drove a dark blue luxury sedan. Holt pulled his cruiser up to the bumper and tapped the license plate into his mobile data terminal. The screen blinked back the registered owner, Marcus A. Langston. A slow, malicious grin spread across Holt's face. He looked at the parking space. The sedan was perfectly centered. The county official placard was clearly visible through the windshield, but the rear left tire was resting perhaps 2 inches over the faded white line that separated the county lot from a designated fire lane. A fire lane that hadn't been used or repainted since an adjacent building was demolished years prior. To any rational officer, it was a non-issue. To Holt, it was a golden opportunity for petty, vindictive revenge. "Let's see how high and mighty you feel when you're riding the bus, counselor," Holt muttered to himself. He didn't call the city dispatch for a municipal tow. That would leave an official paper trail a supervisor might flag. Instead, Holt reached for his personal cell phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Pennington Towing, Royce speaking," a raspy voice answered. "Royce, it's Gideon," Holt said, his eyes locked on the DA's car. "I got a live one for you down on Elm, right behind the courthouse annex, impeding a fire lane. Real public safety hazard." Royce Pennington chuckled, a wet, phlegmy sound. "Right behind the courthouse? You sure about this, Gideon? That's heavy brass territory." "Just hook it and book it, Royce," Holt sneered. "And take it all the way out to the county line yard. Make sure this one gets the premium storage fee." "You got it, boss. Be there in 10. Holt sat in his idling cruiser, watching like a predator as the rusted flatbed of Pennington Towing rattled down the street. He watched Royce jump out, hook the winch to the front axle of the beautiful, expensive sedan, and drag it violently up the steel ramp. The screech of the sedan's tires scraping against the metal was music to Holt's ears. He didn't write a ticket. He didn't leave a notice. He just watched the car disappear around the corner, spat his tobacco juice onto the pavement, and drove away, feeling like the king of Oakage County once again. He had no idea he had just lit the fuse on a bomb that would obliterate his world. As evening fell, Marcus Langston loosened his silk tie, grabbed his leather briefcase, and walked out of the heavy glass doors of the courthouse. The oppressive afternoon heat had given way to a muggy, stagnant evening. He was mentally reviewing his schedule for the next day, calculating the political capital he would need to spend to get Mayor Victor Lang to sign off on an independent police oversight board. Langston turned the corner into the municipal lot and stopped dead in his tracks. The spot where he had parked was empty, just a rectangle of oil-stained concrete staring back at him. For a brief, irrational second, Langston thought he might have parked on a different street, but his memory was photographic. He looked down at his feet. There, etched into the soft, hot asphalt, were fresh, deep gouges, the unmistakable drag marks of a tow winch. Langston didn't panic. He didn't scream or kick a trash can. He was a man who had built his career on cold, analytical composure. He pulled out his phone and dialed the police non-emergency line. Oakage Dispatch, Operator 44, state your emergency or inquiry. This is District Attorney Marcus Langston. I'm calling to report a vehicle missing from the Elm Street Municipal Lot or to determine if it was impounded. License plate Delta Romeo 792. There was a long pause, followed by the sound of furious typing. The dispatcher's voice returned, suddenly tense. Mr. Langston, yes, sir. The vehicle was towed earlier today. The authorizing officer was Officer Gideon Holt, badge 714. The cited violation is impeding a designated emergency fire zone. Langston's eyes narrowed. He looked at the faded yellow curb yards away. He knew Holt's name. It was at the top of a very thick file sitting on his desk. Which impound lot operator? Pennington Towing, sir. Out on Route 9. Thank you. Langston hung up. He didn't call the chief of police to complain. He didn't demand a squad car come pick him up. He simply opened his Uber app and requested a ride. The drive out to Route 9 took some time. Pennington Towing was a sprawling dirt lot, a graveyard of wrecked metal and chain-link fences topped with razor wire, situated on the industrial edge of the county. The smell of diesel fuel and rotting garbage hung heavy in the air. Langston walked into the tiny, stiflingly hot portable office that served as the front desk. Behind a sheet of scratched, bulletproof glass sat Royce Pennington, a heavy-set man with grease-stained hands and a smug expression. "Help you?" Pennington grunted, not looking up from a dirty tabloid magazine. "I'm here to retrieve my vehicle, midnight blue luxury sedan," Langston said, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. Pennington punched some keys on an ancient computer. "Yeah, I got it. Impeding a fire lane. That'll be a hook fee, plus dolly, and overnight storage charge." "It hasn't been overnight," Langston pointed out quietly. "Past closing counts as overnight, buddy. Town ordinance," Pennington said, grinning now. "Total is $425, cash only." Langston looked through the glass. In the back office, the door was cracked open. Sitting on a folding chair, drinking a can of cheap beer and laughing silently, was Officer Gideon Holt. Holt locked eyes with Langston, raised his beer in a mock toast, and let out a booming laugh. It was a blatant display of power, a message: I can take your property, I can inconvenience you, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. Langston didn't break eye contact with Holt. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his money clip, and counted out the exact amount in crisp bills. He slid them under the slot. "I need an itemized, stamped receipt," Langston said to Pennington, "and I want a copy of the police authorization form." "Whatever," Pennington muttered, snatching the cash and printing out a crude receipt. "Sign the release." Langston walked out to the dirt lot. His beautiful car was covered in a thick layer of dust. He walked around it slowly. He noticed deep, fresh scratches on the front lower bumper where the winch chains had been improperly secured. He took out his phone and meticulously photographed the damage, the license plate, the surroundings, and the receipt. He climbed into the car and started the engine. As he drove out of the gates, he saw Holt standing by his cruiser, a smirk plastered across his face. Langston didn't scowl. He didn't flip the officer off. As the air conditioning cooled his face, his mind was already shifting into a gear Holt couldn't possibly comprehend. Holt thought this was a street fight. He thought he had just won a turf war. But Marcus Langston didn't fight in the streets. He fought in courtrooms. And he was about to unleash a legal reckoning upon the Oakage Police Department. In the days that followed, the district attorney's office was functioning at a terrifyingly quiet frequency. Langston arrived early. He had summoned his chief investigator, Sabrina Knox, into his office. Knox was a former FBI forensic accountant who had left the bureau for a quieter life only to find herself deeply bored until Langston hired her. She was brilliant, relentless, and possessed a deeply cynical view of local law enforcement. Langston slid the Pennington towing receipt and the photographs of his car across his mahogany desk. "Officer Gideon Holt had my car illegally towed," Langston said flatly. Knox raised an eyebrow. Are you kidding me? He towed the DA's car. The hubris is almost impressive. It's not hubris, Sabrina. It's an illusion of invulnerability, Langston replied, steepling his fingers. He did it to embarrass me. He did it because he thinks the badge makes him a king. But what caught my attention wasn't the tow itself. It was the operation at Pennington Towing. Cash only. Exorbitant immediate fees. And Holt was sitting in the back office drinking a beer while I paid it. Knox sat up straighter. The scent of blood was in the water. You think they're running a racket? I don't think it. I know it, Langston said. A cop like Holt doesn't just spontaneously decide to use a specific tow company out of nowhere. There's a relationship there. I want you to pull every single parking violation impound record and tow authorization issued by Officer Gideon Holt over the years. Cross-reference them with Pennington Towing. Then I want a full financial background check on Royce Pennington, his LLC, and anyone connected to his business. Marcus, Knox said, dropping the formalities. If we open this door, the police union is going to declare open warfare on this office. Captain Quentin Hale and the old guard will paralyze our prosecutions. They'll stop responding to subpoenas. They'll initiate a blue flu. Let them, Langston said, his voice as hard as flint. I was elected to clean this city up. If we have to tear the precinct down to the foundation to do it, bring me a sledgehammer. In the weeks that followed, a secret war room operated out of the windowless basement of the DA's building. Only Langston, Knox, and 2 trusted paralegals had access. What they uncovered was a conspiracy so deeply entrenched and breathtakingly corrupt that it made Langston sick to his stomach. Knox laid out the massive flowcharts on the basement walls. The data was damning. Over the years, Officer Holt had authorized a vast number of vehicle tows. A staggering percentage of those tows were routed exclusively to Pennington Towing, entirely bypassing the city's rotational list of contracted bonded tow operators. But it was the demographics that turned the corruption into a civil rights atrocity. Look at the heat map, Marcus, Knox said, pointing a laser pointer at a massive map of Oakage County. The north side, the wealthy, predominantly white neighborhoods, was virtually blank, but the south side was covered in red dots. He's targeting minority neighborhoods. Langston observed, his jaw clenching. Low-income housing, apartment complexes, factory parking lots. Exactly, Knox said. He targets people who can't afford to fight back, single mothers, shift workers, immigrants. He fabricates violations, blocking sidewalks that don't exist, expired tags that aren't actually expired, and calls Royce Pennington. Pennington swoops in, tows the car, and demands a minimum of hundreds of dollars in cash to release it. And what happens if they can't pay, Langston asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it. After 30 days, Pennington claims abandoned property, files a mechanic's lien, and auctions the cars off. Sometimes he just scraps them, Knox explained, pulling out a financial dossier. But here is the kill shot, Marcus. I dug into the corporate structure of Pennington Towing LLC. Royce Pennington isn't the sole owner. She slapped a printout from the Secretary of State's office onto the table. Pennington is the registered agent, the silent partner holding a 50% equity stake through a shell corporation called Blue Line Logistics is a woman named Lorna Pennington. Langston stared at the name. His wife. Yes, Knox smiled grimly. Lorna Pennington, whose maiden name is Lorna Holt. She is Gideon Holt's younger sister. The puzzle pieces locked together with a deafening click. It wasn't just petty harassment, it was a massive, highly organized racketeering enterprise. Holt used his badge to steal cars from poor people under the color of law. His brother-in-law held the cars hostage for cash, and the profits were funneled right back into Holt's pockets through his sister's shell company. Over the years, they had extorted a substantial sum from the most vulnerable citizens of Oakage. Langston felt a terrifying righteous clarity wash over him. This isn't a badge misconduct complaint. This is Title 18, United States Code, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. Extortion under color of official right, wire fraud, civil rights violations. If we take this to a grand jury locally, it'll leak, Knox warned. Captain Hale has moles in the clerk's office. We aren't going local, Langston said softly. I'm calling the state attorney general and we're bringing in the civil rights division of the FBI. Oblivious to the sword dangling over his neck, Holt's arrogance only grew. Believing he had successfully intimidated the DA, he began to openly taunt Langston's staff. In the days after the tow, Holt pulled over Jillian Hart, Langston's chief of staff, a brilliant young lawyer who had been instrumental in drafting the police reform bills. It was raining. Holt walked up to her window, shining his heavy flashlight directly into her eyes. License and registration, Holt barked. Officer, what is the reason for this stop? Jillian asked, shielding her eyes, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. Broken tail light? Holt lied smoothly. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. You work for Langston, don't you? Yes, I do, she replied. Tell your boss to watch where he parks, Holt whispered, a nasty, threatening edge to his voice. Streets are dangerous. Bad things happen to nice cars. He didn't write her a ticket. He just walked away, leaving her sitting in the rain, trembling with anger. When Jillian reported the incident to Langston the next day, he didn't react with anger. He just nodded slowly. Holt was digging his own grave with a backhoe. Langston picked up his secure phone and dialed the private cell number of Adrian Vale, the lead federal prosecutor for the district. Adrian, it's Marcus. I have a package for you. It's a localized RICO conspiracy involving the Oakage Police Department. I have the paper trail, the financial links, and a clear pattern of civil rights violations. How big? Vale asked on the other end. Big enough to end careers, Langston promised. We need Title III wiretaps on 3 phones, and we need them immediately. I want to hear every word Gideon Holt and Royce Pennington say to each other. The federal machine woke up. In the months that followed, Holt and Pennington were the stars of their very own FBI reality show, and they didn't even know it. Agents sat in vans, listening in real time as Holt casually called in fake toes, laughed about targeting minorities, and explicitly demanded his cut of the cash on recorded lines. The net was woven tight. There were no holes. On a crisp morning, Marcus Langston stood in his office, looking out the window at the city skyline. At dawn, a fleet of black SUVs rolled into Oakage County. The hammer was about to drop. At dawn on that crisp morning, the illusion of Gideon Holt's empire shattered. The operation was executed with the chilling, synchronized precision that only the federal government could orchestrate. There were no local sirens, no courtesy calls to the Oakage police chief, and absolutely no warning. A convoy of matte black vehicles and armored tactical vehicles descended on 3 locations simultaneously. Pennington Towing, on Route 9, the suburban home of Lorna and Royce Pennington, and a modest split-level house on the edge of the county where Officer Gideon Holt slept. Holt was jolted awake by a sound he had delivered to countless others but never expected to hear himself, the deafening splintering of his own front door being battered off its hinges. FBI, federal warrant, show me your hands. Holt scrambled out of bed, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. He instinctively reached for his service weapon on the nightstand, but before his fingers could even brush the cold steel, the bedroom door was kicked open. 3 heavily armed FBI SWAT agents flooded the room, assault rifles leveled directly at his chest. The blinding beam of a tactical light pinned him against the wall. "Don't even breathe toward that gun," the lead agent barked, his voice devoid of any professional courtesy. "Hands on your head, turn around now." Holt, clad only in his boxer shorts, raised his hands. Confusion warred with his deeply ingrained arrogance. Hold on, he stammered, his voice cracking. "I'm Oakage PD, I'm on the job. You guys are making a massive mistake." "We know exactly who you are, Officer Holt," Special Agent in Charge Gregory Hayes said as he stepped into the room holding a thick sheaf of papers. "Gideon Holt, you are under arrest for violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, extortion under color of official right, and deprivation of civil rights under the color of law." The words hit Holt like a physical blow. RICO. Federal charges. The color drained from his face as the agent slammed him roughly against his own dresser and ratcheted the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The terrifying reality of his situation began to set in. He wasn't dealing with internal affairs. He wasn't dealing with a slap on the wrist from a friendly police chief. He was in the grip of the Department of Justice. Simultaneously, out on Route 9, Pennington Towing was being dismantled. Dozens of federal agents swarmed the dirt lot. They seized computers, filing cabinets, and the contents of a hidden floor safe that contained a substantial amount in undocumented cash. Royce Pennington didn't even make it to the handcuffs before he broke. Standing in his pajamas in his own driveway, watching agents tear apart his wife's home office, Royce immediately asked for a deal. The brotherhood he and Holt shared evaporated the second Royce faced a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. By mid-morning, the news had hit the Oakage Police Department like a tactical nuke. Chief Harlan Crow, a red-faced, barrel-chested man who had protected Holt for years, stormed into the district attorney's office, bypassing the reception desk entirely. He threw open the doors to Marcus Langston's suite, his eyes bulging with rage. "What the hell is going on, Marcus?" Crow roared, slamming his palms onto the DA's mahogany desk. "The feds just perp-walked one of my senior officers out of his house in his underwear. They bypassed my entire chain of command. You set this up." Langston didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He calmly finished signing a motion, capped his fountain pen, and looked up at the chief. "Take a seat, Harlan. Or don't, but lower your voice." "You brought the FBI into my precinct over a parking dispute," Crow spat, though his bravado was faltering under Langston's dead-eyed stare. "You're destroying a man's life because he towed your precious car." "I brought the FBI into your precinct, Chief, because you allowed a criminal enterprise to operate out of your locker room," Langston replied, standing up. He picked up a thick-bound dossier from his desk and tossed it violently. It landed at Crow's feet with a heavy thud. "That is a years-long forensic accounting of Officer Holt's towing history. over 1,000 vehicles. A substantial sum extorted from the poorest, most vulnerable citizens of Oakage, funneled directly into a shell company owned by Holt's sister. He didn't just tow my car, Harlan. He has been terrorizing the South Side under your protection, and I have it all on Title III wiretaps. Crow stared at the dossier, the color washing out of his face. The fight completely left his body. Wiretaps, financial records, RICO. The old guard playbook of sweeping things under the rug was entirely useless against a federal grand jury indictment. The police union, Crow started weakly. Will not touch him, Langston interrupted. I spoke to the union president an hour ago. Once I read him the summary of the extortion charges and mentioned the FBI Civil Rights Division, he explicitly stated they will not be funding Holt's legal defense. He is entirely alone. Langston leaned over the desk, his eyes burning with years of built-up frustration against a broken system. I told you I was going to clean up this city, Harlan. Holt was the infection. Consider this the amputation. Now get out of my office and go try to salvage whatever is left of your department's reputation. Down in the federal holding cells, Gideon Holt sat shivering on a stainless steel bench. For the first time in years, he was entirely stripped of his power. He had used his badge as a weapon, and now it was gone. The only thing waiting for him was a judge, a jury, and the terrifying realization that he was about to face the very justice system he had spent his career manipulating. The criminal trial of the United States versus Gideon Holt was not a battle. It was a clinical, methodical slaughter. From the moment the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung open, it was clear that Holt's reign of terror had reached its terminal conclusion. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. Reporters filled the back benches, and citizens from the South Side, people who had spent years being victimized in silence, lined the gallery. Federal prosecutor Adrian Vale moved through his case in chief with the terrifying precision of a surgeon. He didn't rely on grand theatrics. He relied on an avalanche of undeniable data. For days, Vale paraded the victims of Holt's extortion ring in front of the jury. Single mothers who had lost their jobs because they couldn't get to work, elderly men who had their only mode of transportation auctioned off for pennies, young college students who had their savings wiped out to pay Pennington towing. But the fatal blow to Holt's defense wasn't the victims' tearful testimonies, nor was it Sabrina Knox's masterful breakdown of the forensic accounting. The fatal blow was Royce Pennington. Desperate to avoid dying in a federal penitentiary, Royce had taken an aggressive plea deal and turned state's evidence. When Royce's name was called to the witness stand, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. He wore a rumpled, ill-fitting suit, a stark contrast to his usual grease-stained coveralls. As he raised his right hand to swear the oath, he steadfastly refused to look at the defense table. Royce didn't just throw his brother-in-law under the bus, he reversed over him. Guided by Vale's sharp questioning, Royce detailed the entire operation from its inception. He explained the encrypted radio codes Holt used to signal a lucrative target. He described the cash drops that took place in brown paper bags during Sunday family barbecues, the money handed over while children played in the yard. Then came the centerpiece of Royce's testimony, the ledger. Royce handed the prosecution the meticulously kept handwritten accounting book his wife Lorna had hidden beneath the floorboards of their home. Every illegal tow, every fabricated violation, and every split of the cash was documented. It was a roadmap of pure, unadulterated corruption. Yet Vale saved his most devastating weapon for the final afternoon of the prosecution's case. He submitted a flash drive into evidence, the Title III FBI wiretaps. The courtroom speakers crackled to life. It was a recording from late in the summer, mere weeks before the federal raid. The pristine acoustics of the federal courthouse amplified Gideon Holt's recorded voice, dripping with contempt, entitlement, and sheer arrogance. "I got another live one for you, Royce," Holt's voice echoed, accompanied by the faint sound of his cruiser's turn signal clicking in the background. "Down at the Cypress Housing Projects. Nice little silver Honda Civic. The tags are good and she's parked legal, but I'm writing it up as a public nuisance blocking a fire hydrant. Let the single mom ride the bus for a few weeks and think about her life choices. Make sure you hit her with the maximum overnight storage fee, brother. Daddy needs that new cedar deck for the backyard before the holiday." A collective audible gasp swept through the gallery. Several jurors physically recoiled in their seats, their faces twisting in absolute disgust. In the front row, Marcus Langston sat perfectly motionless. His face was an unreadable mask of stone, his eyes fixed on the defense table. At that table, Gideon Holt physically shattered. The arrogant, thick-necked cop who had terrorized the streets was gone. He shrank into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands, trying to hide from the burning stares of the jury and the public. He couldn't hide behind the thin blue line anymore. The entire world had just heard him for what he truly was, a predator masquerading as a protector. The next morning, before the defense attorney could even attempt to present a hollow opening statement for their side, Holt surrendered. Approaching the bench with his head bowed, his lawyer announced that Holt was changing his plea to guilty on all federal counts. The criminal fight was over, but Marcus Langston's war was fought on two fronts. While the federal government secured Holt's impending imprisonment, Langston had quietly set the stage to obliterate the corrupt financial and political infrastructure that had allowed the officer to thrive. As a sitting district attorney, Langston was legally barred from filing civil lawsuits against the city. But his former law school roommate and notoriously ruthless civil rights attorney Dominic Shaw operated under no such restrictions. The moment Holt's guilty plea was entered into the federal record, Langston arranged for Shaw to receive the entire unsealed federal evidence file. Armed with a mountain of absolute judicially validated proof, Shaw filed a monstrous multi-million-dollar class-action civil rights lawsuit against the city of Oakage, the Oakage Police Department, and Gideon Holt personally. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal destruction. It alleged a systemic, decades-long failure to supervise, train, and discipline officers, explicitly pointing to Holt's numerous buried citizen complaints as undeniable proof that the city's leadership was entirely complicit in the extortion ring. The city council and Mayor Victor Lang panicked. The evidence was completely indefensible. Taking a class action suit of this magnitude to a civil jury in the current political climate would result in a verdict that could literally bankrupt the municipality. Within weeks, the city capitulated, agreeing to a staggering multi-million-dollar settlement. This money was placed in a restitution fund for the hundreds of victims Holt had preyed upon over the years. But Langston hadn't engineered the lawsuit just for the money. Buried within the binding settlement agreement was a non-negotiable stipulation. Mayor Lang was legally mandated to immediately create and fully fund the Independent Civilian Police Oversight Board, the exact institution the political establishment had spent years blocking. Seeing the undeniable writing on the wall, and terrified that he might be named in a secondary federal probe regarding the buried complaints, Police Chief Harlan Crow didn't wait to be fired. He quietly cleared out his office under the cover of darkness and submitted his early retirement papers, fleeing the city in disgrace. And then came the bureaucratic execution that finally broke Holt's spirit entirely. Because Holt had pled guilty to severe federal felonies committed while explicitly acting under the color of official law, a state tribunal was convened to invoke a rarely used punitive municipal statute. In a hearing that lasted less than 20 minutes, Gideon Holt was permanently stripped of his law enforcement pension. Every single dime he had paid into the retirement system over his career was seized and liquidated to help fund the restitution payments to his victims. He was left with absolutely nothing. No savings, no future, no safety net. On the day of his formal sentencing, Holt stood before Federal District Judge Priscilla Holt. He wore a bright orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a heavy chain around his waist. He looked years older, the hollow, terrified stare of a ruined man replacing the smug smirk he had worn just months prior. "Mr. Holt," Judge Holt began, her voice echoing coldly in the cavernous room, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "Law enforcement officers are granted extraordinary, almost unfathomable power by the public trust. You weaponized that sacred trust. You did not protect and serve your community. You hunted and extorted them. You specifically targeted those who you believed had no voice, no financial power, and no legal recourse. And you did it out of sheer, unadulterated greed and vindictive spite." She adjusted her glasses, staring down at him from the elevated bench with absolute contempt. "You believed your badge made you immune to the consequences of your actions. You believed you were above the law. Let today serve as a permanent reminder to anyone who wears a uniform that the law is a very heavy object to have fall upon you. I sentence you to 144 months in federal prison to be served consecutively with no possibility of early release or parole." As the heavy-set U.S. Marshals grabbed Holt by the arms to lead him toward the holding cells, he stopped. He looked back over his shoulder into the packed gallery. He bypassed the reporters and the victims, locking eyes with Marcus Langston one final time. Langston didn't gloat. He didn't offer a triumphant smile. He simply offered a slow, deliberate nod, a silent, chilling acknowledgement of a promise kept. The district attorney picked up his leather briefcase, turned his back on the disgraced, ruined cop, and walked out of the courtroom ready to get back to the work of rebuilding his city. The heavy reinforced steel door of the cell slammed shut with a deafening metallic finality that echoed through the bleak corridors of the Federal Correctional Institution. It was a sound Gideon Holt would have to get used to. He was no longer Officer Holt. He was an inmate in the federal system. Because of his status as a former law enforcement officer, putting Holt in the general population was equivalent to a death sentence. The federal prison system was overflowing with men who harbored a deep, violent hatred for the badge. Consequently, Holt was placed in the Special Housing Unit, a segregated wing designed for high-profile inmates, informants, and disgraced cops. It was, for all intents and purposes, solitary confinement. For 23 hours a day, Holt sat in a concrete box measuring 6 feet by 9 feet. There was a thin mattress on a steel slab, a stainless steel toilet, and a narrow slit of frosted glass that let in a dull, mocking sliver of daylight. The man who had once roamed the streets of Oakage in a climate-controlled cruiser, barking orders and watching citizens tremble, was now entirely powerless. He dictated nothing, he controlled nothing. He was told when to wake, when to eat the tasteless, tepid food shoved through a slot in his door, and when to take his single hour of recreation in a chain-link cage under the watchful eyes of armed guards. In the suffocating silence of his cell, the arrogance that had defined his life slowly rotted into a desperate, gnawing paranoia. Holt had endless hours to replay the events in his mind. The midnight blue sedan, the smug call to Royce Pennington, the petty joy of watching the DA's car dragged away. He had traded a comfortable life, a guaranteed pension, and his freedom for a momentary thrill of spite. While Holt withered in the dark, the city of Oakage was undergoing a painful, spectacular rebirth. Marcus Langston did not rest on the laurels of his victory. Taking down Holt and the Pennington towing extortion ring was only the amputation of the most infected limb. Langston was determined to cure the whole body. The multi-million-dollar class action settlement had bankrupted the political capital of the old guard. Mayor Victor Lang, terrified of further federal scrutiny, gave Langston virtually everything he demanded. The Oakage Civilian Police Oversight Board was officially ratified. It wasn't a toothless committee of political appointees. Langston ensured the board had subpoena power, independent investigators, and the authority to recommend the immediate termination of officers who violated civil rights. But the remnants of the old Oakage Police Department didn't surrender quietly. Captain Quentin Hale, a veteran and a close friend of the disgraced Chief Crow, attempted to organize a subtle rebellion. Hale encouraged his patrolmen to engage in a work slowdown, a deliberate stalling of response times to the south side, hoping the spike in petty crime would force the city to dismantle the oversight board. Langston saw the mutiny forming before it even fully materialized. He called his chief investigator, Sabrina Knox. "Hale is playing games," Langston said, staring at the weekly dispatch metrics that showed response times in minority neighborhoods had inexplicably doubled. "He thinks he can hold the city hostage." "He's using the union to shield himself," Knox replied, tapping a pen against her notebook. "The patrolmen won't talk. They're terrified of retaliation." "We don't need them to talk. We have the data," Langston said, his voice cold and resolute. "Audit the GPS trackers on every cruiser in Hale's sector. Cross-reference their idle times with the incoming 911 logs. If they are sitting in parking lots while emergency calls are holding, we don't just fire them. We indict them for official misconduct and reckless endangerment." The audit was brutal and incredibly swift. Knox uncovered that Hale had explicitly ordered units to stand down on nonviolent calls in the South Side. Armed with the digital proof, Langston didn't bother with a closed-door meeting. He bypassed the department entirely and took the evidence directly to the newly formed Oversight Board's first public hearing. In a packed city council chamber with local news cameras rolling, Langston laid out the GPS data. He publicly accused Captain Hale of weaponizing public safety for political leverage. Under the glaring lights of public scrutiny and facing the terrifying prospect of joining Holt in federal prison, Hale's resolve crumbled. He resigned in disgrace the very next morning, taking 3 of his most toxic loyalist sergeants with him. The purge sent a shockwave through the precinct. The message was unmistakable. The era of the untouchable badge was dead and buried. To replace the outgoing rot, Mayor Victor Lang, heavily influenced by Langston, brought in an outside reformer as the new chief of police, Chief Sebastian Rourke, a man known for transparency and community-based policing. Rourke immediately implemented mandatory de-escalation training, strict auditing of all impounds, and a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling. On the south side, the atmosphere slowly began to change. The settlement funds began flowing into the community. Families who had been financially crippled by Holt's extortion ring received heavy restitution checks. Single mothers got their savings back. Men who had lost their jobs because they couldn't afford to rescue their cars from Pennington Towing found themselves with the capital to start over. For the first time in generations, the residents of the South Side looked at the district attorney's office not as an instrument of oppression, but as a shield. And what of the Pennington family? The criminal conspiracy had fractured them beyond repair. Royce Pennington served his time in a minimum security facility. His marriage to Holt's sister was completely destroyed. Lorna Pennington, the architect of the shell company, avoided prison by cooperating fully and turning over every hidden asset, but she was left utterly destitute. The federal government seized her home, her bank accounts, and her vehicles. She was forced to move into a tiny, rundown apartment on the outskirts of the county, working night shifts at a fulfillment center just to survive. Forever marked as a convicted felon, the empire of petty tyranny had been burned to the ground. But the final chapter of Gideon Holt's story had yet to be written. In time, the city of Oakage was fundamentally different. Crime rates had stabilized. Police-community relations were experiencing unprecedented levels of trust, and Marcus Langston had just won his re-election campaign in a historic landslide, securing the vast majority of the vote. He was no longer just a district attorney. He was a rising star in state politics, heavily favored for a future run at higher office. Jillian Hart, the chief of staff whom Holt had once intimidated, was now the deputy district attorney leading a task force dedicated to cold case civil rights violations. The DA's office was a well-oiled machine of justice, blind to wealth and deaf to the old boy network. Inside the walls of the Federal Correctional Institution, time had not been kind to Gideon Holt. Years in solitary confinement had stripped away his physical bulk and his sanity. His hair had thinned and turned entirely gray. His posture, once broad and intimidating, was permanently stooped. The terrifying reality of his long sentence was an inescapable weight pressing down on his chest every waking second. Holt had spent the first years fighting. He had filed endless appeals claiming entrapment, claiming selective prosecution, and arguing that his sentence was disproportionately harsh. Every single appeal was swiftly and mercilessly denied by the appellate courts. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, the public corruption too severe. Desperation is a powerful force. It strips a man of his pride layer by agonizing layer until only a naked, trembling need remains. Having exhausted all legal avenues, Holt did the unthinkable. He requested a pen and a single sheet of paper from the prison guard. Sitting on the edge of his steel bed, his hands shaking, he wrote a letter to the one man who possessed the power to recommend a sentence commutation to the Department of Justice. He wrote to District Attorney Marcus Langston. The letter was a masterpiece of pathetic manipulation. Holt didn't truly apologize for the lives he had ruined. He apologized that things had gotten out of hand. He wrote about the mental toll of solitary confinement. He begged Langston as a man of God and the law to show mercy. He asked Langston to submit a letter of support to the Federal Parole Board to shave a few years off his sentence, promising he would move away, change his name, and never return to Oakage. A week later, Jillian Hart walked into Langston's spacious corner office and dropped a plain white envelope stamped with the federal prison insignia onto his desk. "You're going to want to read this," Jillian said, an unreadable expression on her face. "It's from the federal prison. Inmate Holt." Langston picked up the envelope. He used a silver letter opener to slice it open and unfolded the single sheet of ruled paper. The handwriting was cramped, erratic, a stark contrast to the bold, aggressive citations Holt used to write on fabricated parking tickets. Langston read the letter in total silence. His expression never changed. He didn't smile in triumph, nor did he frown in pity. He read the words of a broken man, begging for the very mercy he had aggressively denied to hundreds of innocent citizens for years. "What does he want?" Jillian asked. "He wants a recommendation for a sentence reduction," Langston replied softly. "He says he's learned his lesson. He says the cage is breaking his mind." "Are you going to respond?" Langston leaned back in his leather chair and looked out the window. Down below, the city of Oakage moved in a steady, peaceful rhythm. He thought about the heat map Sabrina Knox had generated years ago, the sea of red dots clustered over the poorest neighborhoods. He thought about the single mothers forced to choose between feeding their children and paying an extortion fee to get their cars back. He thought about the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of a man who believed the law was merely a tool for his own enrichment. Mercy is a virtue, but justice is a requirement. Langston opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a thick file labeled United States versus Holt, archival. He flipped through the meticulously organized pages until he found what he was looking for. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a legal brief or an FBI wiretap transcript. It was a photocopy of a crude, grease-stained receipt from Pennington Towing, the same receipt Langston had demanded on that sweltering evening years prior, the receipt for the cash payment. Langston took a thick black marker and wrote 3 words across the top of the receipt: "Denied. Serve your time." He didn't write a letter. He didn't explain his reasoning. He simply folded the photocopy, slid it into a fresh envelope, addressed it back to the inmate, and handed it to Jillian. "Mail this," Langston instructed, "and then close the file. We are done with Gideon Holt forever." When the envelope arrived at the federal prison, Holt tore it open with frantic, trembling fingers, praying for a lifeline. When he pulled out the photocopy of the tow receipt and read the black ink across the top, the last remaining shred of his hope evaporated. The paper slipped from his hands and fluttered to the cold concrete floor. Holt sat on his steel bunk, buried his face in his hands, and finally wept. He had towed a car to teach a man a lesson. Instead, he had dismantled his own life, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the 4 walls of a cage. That evening, as the sun dipped below the Oakage skyline, casting long golden shadows across the streets, Marcus Langston left the courthouse. He walked with the confident, steady stride of a man who had kept his promises to his city. He turned the corner and walked into the municipal parking lot. The faded yellow lines of the old fire lane had long since been removed, repainted into perfectly measured, pristine parking stalls. Langston walked up to his car, the same midnight blue luxury sedan. He unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The dashboard lit up a soft, high-tech glow in the fading light. As he pulled out of the lot and merged onto Elm Street, nobody watched him from the shadows. No corrupt officer ran his plates. No tow trucks waited around the block. There was only the quiet hum of the engine and the profound, undeniable presence of justice in a city that had finally learned how to fight back. Power without accountability is a dangerous weapon, but as Officer Gideon Holt learned the hard way, arrogance is the ultimate trap. He thought his badge made him a king, giving him the right to extort, humiliate, and steal from the vulnerable. But he messed with the wrong district attorney. Marcus Langston didn't fight back with yelling or violence. He fought back with the devastating, crushing weight of the law, permanently changing a city and ending a corrupt empire. The hunter became the hunted, and a petty parking dispute ended in a long federal prison sentence. True justice doesn't boast, it executes. What did you think of District Attorney Langston's brilliant, silent revenge? Did Officer Holt get exactly what he deserved, or was the punishment too harsh? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true life stories where the bad guys finally get what's coming to them.